February 19, 1945, 09:02 a.m., Green Beach, Iwo Jima. The ramp of the Higgins boat slammed down into the surf, not with a cinematic splash, but with a grinding industrial thud against heavy, black volcanic ash. For the men of the 28th Marine Regiment, the world instantly dissolved into a monochromatic nightmare of gray smoke, black sand, and the invisible, supersonic snap of thousands of Japanese bullets. This wasn't a beach. It was a slaughterhouse floor designed by engineers who had spent 20 years preparing for this exact moment. Corporal Tony Stein didn't run. You couldn't run on Iwo Jima. The sand, composed of coarse volcanic grit, sucked at boots like quicksand, robbing a man of his balance and his speed just when he needed them most. Stein, a 23-year-old from Dayton, Ohio, stepped off the ramp carrying something that shouldn't have existed. It looked like a weapon designed by a madman in a junkyard, a grotesque, oily amalgamation of a rifle, a machine gun, and aircraft parts, welded together with ugly functional scars. To his left, a private carrying a standard-issue Browning automatic rifle, BR, dropped to one knee and opened fire at a pillbox concealed in the scrub brush 150 yards away. Chug, 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 chug. The bar's slow, rhythmic cadence of 500 rounds per minute was respectable in 1918, but here, against the fanatical defense of the Imperial Japanese Army, it sounded pathetic. It sounded like a toy. The Japanese Nambu machine guns answered with a buzzsaw tear of 800 rounds per minute, forcing the Marine to bury his face in the ash. The physics of suppression were brutal and simple. If you can't put more lead in the air than the enemy, you don't move. And on Iwo Jima, if you didn't move, you died. Stein adjusted his grip on the strange weapon. He felt the heat radiating from the barrel even before he fired. He wasn't just a Marine. Before the war, he had been a professional toolmaker and a construction worker. He understood metal. He understood tolerances. And most importantly, he understood that the standard-issue tools the Marine Corps had given him were not fast enough to keep his friends alive. 3 months earlier, while stationed in a supply depot in Hawaii, Stein had looked at the wings of a wrecked Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber and seen an opportunity that military bureaucracy would have called a court-martial offense. Inside the wing sat the AN-M2 .30 caliber Browning machine gun. It was a marvel of aerial engineering, lightened barrel, skeletonized receiver, and a firing cycle tuned to a terrifying 1,350 rounds per minute. It was designed to be fired by a solenoid switch in a cockpit, cooled by the 300 mm slipstream of a diving aircraft, and fed by massive belt boxes. It was never, under any circumstances, meant to be carried by a single infantryman. "You can't hip-fire an aircraft gun, Tony," his squad leader had told him. "It'll melt the barrel, the recoil will dislocate your shoulder, and where are you going to get a trigger?" Stein didn't argue. He went to the machine shop. He took the AN-M2, which weighed a manageable 25 pounds, surprisingly light for its firepower. But it had no stock, no sights, and no trigger mechanism suited for human hands. It was just a rectangular steel box that spit death. Stein grabbed a wrecked M1 Garand stock and, with the precision of a man who had built industrial dies, fabricated a mounting bracket. He cannibalized a trigger group from a broken bar, modifying the sear to interact with the aircraft gun's rapid-fire bolt. He welded a bipod from a bar to the front. But the piece de resistance was the feed mechanism. The gun ate ammunition so fast, 22 rounds every second, that a standard box magazine would be empty in a heartbeat. Stein wasn't worried about reloading. He was worried about feeding the beast. He improvised a belt feed system that could drag a 100-round belt of ammunition out of a box he rigged to his hip. He called it the Stinger. It was ugly. It was unauthorized. And as Stein looked up at the looming mass of Mount Suribachi, he knew it was the only thing that could cut a path through the concrete hell awaiting them. "Move up! Get off the beach!" the lieutenant screamed, his voice barely audible over the roar of mortars impacting the black sand. The squad surged forward, only to be instantly pinned down by a concealed concrete bunker 40 yards ahead. The aperture was a narrow slit, barely 6 inches high, spewing fire. Grenades fell short, rolling harmlessly down the ash slopes. Stein stepped out from behind the cover of a wrecked Amtrak. He didn't drop to a prone position. He stood fully upright, legs braced wide in the shifting sand, the Stinger tucked tight against his hip. He didn't aim with sights. At this rate of fire, you aimed with the stream of tracers. He squeezed the improvised trigger. The sound that erupted wasn't a bang or a chug. It was a continuous, tearing brrrr that sounded like canvas being ripped by a giant's hand. In 1 second, 22 .30 .06 armor-piercing bullets slammed into the bunker's aperture. The concrete facing didn't just chip. It disintegrated under the hammer blow of kinetic energy delivered at 3 times the speed of a standard machine gun. The Japanese gunner never had a chance. The sheer volume of fire poured through the slit, ricocheting inside the concrete box like angry hornets. The enemy gun went silent instantly. Stein released the trigger. The barrel of the Stinger was glowing a dull, angry red. Smoke poured from the receiver, smelling of burnt oil and ozone. He turned to his squad, his face smeared with grease and volcanic ash. "Clear," he said. But this was just the first bunker. Ahead of them lay a labyrinth of fortifications that General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent months preparing. Every rock, every fold in the ground covered a spider hole or a tunnel entrance. The Marines were taking fire from 3 sides. The Stinger was hungry, and Stein had only brought enough ammo for a few minutes of this intensity. As they pushed inland, the terrain fought them as hard as the Japanese. The volcanic ash gave way to jagged rock formations that tore uniforms and skin. Stein's weapon, while lighter than a heavy machine gun, was still an awkward, hot piece of machinery to lug uphill. But the effect on the enemy was psychological as much as physical. The Japanese troops were disciplined, hardened veterans. They knew the sound of a bar. They knew the sound of a Thompson. They knew how long they had between bursts to pop up and fire. They did not know what the hell Stein was holding. When the Stinger opened up, the suppression was absolute. No one popped their head up when the air was literally solid with lead. "Ammo! I'm dry!" Stein yelled, the bolt of the Stinger locking back on an empty chamber after he had sawed a sniper out of a palm tree. He looked around. The ammo carriers were pinned down back at the beachhead, 200 yards away, through a gauntlet of mortar fire. A normal soldier would have waited. A normal soldier would have dug a hole and prayed. Stein looked at his boots. They were full of sand, heavy, slipping on the smooth rocks. He looked at the beach. He looked at the Stinger. He sat down and unlaced his boots. "Tony, what the hell are you doing?" his squadmate screamed. "Better traction," Stein grunted, kicking the boots off. "Cover me." Barefoot, with his socks instantly shredding on the razor-sharp volcanic rock, Corporal Tony Stein grabbed his empty ammo boxes and sprinted back toward the beach. He ran not away from the fight, but toward the source of the only thing that mattered: belts of .30 .06 ammunition. Bullets kicked up spurts of black sand around his feet. He vaulted over a crater, slid down a dune, and crashed into the supply dump. "Fill 'em up!" he roared at a terrified supply clerk, tossing the hot metal boxes onto the crate. "And give me another belt for the road." He didn't know it yet, but he would make this trip 7 more times. He was turning the logistics of the battle into a personal athletic event, fueled by adrenaline and the mechanical necessity of keeping his invention fed. The toolmaker from Ohio had forged a weapon that could win the battle, but only if the man holding it was willing to tear his feet to ribbons to keep it singing. As he grabbed the fresh belts and turned back toward the front line, a mortar shell landed close enough to rattle his teeth. The shock wave knocked him down, covering him in hot ash. He shook it off, checked the Stinger's action, sand in the receiver was death for an automatic weapon, and started running back up the hill. He had a job to do. There were 19 bunkers left to kill. 11:45 a.m. The slopes of Mount Suribachi. The skin on Tony Stein's feet was flayed raw, bleeding into the black socks that were now more holes than fabric. He didn't feel it. His world had narrowed down to a terrifyingly simple loop of mechanics. Acquire target, brace against the recoil, unleash the metallic scream of the Stinger, reload. The weapon, designed to be cooled by the 300 mmf wind of a diving airplane, was baking in the tropical heat and the friction of its own violence. The barrel was now permanently discolored, shades of violet and blue ringing the steel, radiating waves of heat that singed the hair on Stein's forearms. They were moving against a reinforced pillbox complex named the Quarry. It was a defensive knot that had stalled the entire battalion. Japanese 25mm anti-aircraft cannons, depressed to fire horizontally, were chopping up rocks and Marines with equal indifference. Standard tactics had failed. A flamethrower team had tried to get close and been cut down. A tank had thrown a track on a mine. Stein crawled forward, the Stinger cradled in his arms like a child. He could see the aperture of the main bunker, a narrow, evil slit in a mound of concrete and earth. He needed to get within 30 yards to be effective. The Stinger had no sights to speak of. Stein walked his fire onto the target, adjusting the stream of bullets like a man watering a garden with a fire hose. A Japanese officer, waving a sword, led a desperate countercharge from a spider hole to the right. 6 enemy soldiers surged forward with bayonets fixed. Stein spun. He didn't panic. He didn't fumble for a sidearm. He simply pivoted at the hips, bringing the Stinger to bear. Brrrr! The burst lasted less than a second. 20 rounds. 6 men dropped as if their strings had been cut. The rate of fire was so high that the bodies were hit multiple times before they hit the ground. The kinetic energy of the Stinger didn't just kill, it pushed. It stopped momentum cold. "Covering fire!" Stein yelled, scrambling up a jagged ridge of rock. His barefoot run gave him a strange agility. He could feel the grip of the rock, finding purchases that boots would have slipped on. He crested the ridge and looked down at the main bunker. He was exposed. He was a silhouette against the gray sky. Every Japanese rifle in the sector turned toward him. Stein didn't care. He depressed the trigger and held it down. The Stinger screamed. A continuous stream of tracer fire poured into the bunker's embrasure. The concrete disintegrated. The logs reinforcing the roof splintered into matchsticks. For 10 seconds, Stein was the loudest, deadliest thing on the island. He suppressed the bunker so completely that a demolition team was able to sprint forward, toss in satchel charges, and seal it forever. "That's one," Stein muttered, sliding back down the ridge to reload. 19 to go. Over the next hour, the battlefield turned into a blur of motion and violence. Stein's unauthorized weapon became the anchor of the advance. Whenever the squad hit a strong point, the cry went up, "Get Tony! Get the Stinger!" And Stein would come, limping on his shredded feet, grinning through a mask of soot. He destroyed a machine gun nest behind a fallen log. He sawed through a palm tree to drop a sniper. He provided covering fire that allowed a wounded corpsman to drag a dying Marine to safety. But the Stinger was a demanding mistress. It ate ammunition faster than the entire platoon could carry it. Stein made his second run to the beach, then his third, then his fourth. Each trip was a gauntlet of death. The route back was under constant mortar observation. On his fifth run, a Nambu machine gun stitched a line of bullets across the sand inches from his heels. Stein dove, rolled, grabbing 2 fresh ammo boxes, 40 pounds of lead, and sprinted back uphill. He was helping carry wounded men down on his return trips, then running back up with ammo. He was a one-man logistics train and a one-man army. By 2 p.m., the Stinger was starting to fail. The barrel was so hot it was smoking even when not firing. The welds on the improvised stock were cracking under the violent vibration of 1,350 rounds per minute. The solenoid mechanism, rigged to a manual trigger, was becoming sticky with carbon buildup and volcanic grit. Stein sat behind a rock, using his combat knife to scrape carbon off the bolt face. He poured canteen water over the barrel, which hissed and steamed like an angry reptile. "She's getting tired, Tony," Private Keller said, looking at the abused weapon. "She's got enough left for the top," Stein said, patting the receiver. The top was a ridge guarding the approach to the airfield, a massive complex of pillboxes. As Stein led the assault, his weapon finally jammed, a failure to extract caused by the immense heat swelling the chamber. He cleared it, racking the charging handle with a violent jerk, burning his hand on the receiver. He stood up to fire. A Japanese soldier popped out of a spider hole 10 feet away. The Stinger was too long to swing in time. Stein didn't hesitate. He swung the weapon like a baseball bat, the heavy steel receiver crushing the attacker. He spun back, leveled the gun, and cleared the spider hole with a point-blank burst. By the time the sun began to dip low, casting long, bloody shadows across the black sand, Corporal Tony Stein had single-handedly neutralized 20 enemy positions. He had carried a weapon that shouldn't have worked, running barefoot over terrain that cut boots to ribbons and delivered more firepower than a standard rifle platoon. February 23, 1945, D+4. The approach to Motoyama Airfield, No. 1. The euphoria of the beach landing was gone. The adrenaline that had fueled Stein's barefoot sprints had burned off, replaced by a grinding, bone-deep exhaustion. The 28th Regiment was no longer fighting on the beaches. They were pushing into the meat grinder of the island's interior. The terrain here was alien, a lunar landscape of sulfur vents, jagged crags, and open killing fields that offered zero cover. Stein sat in a shallow crater, examining the Stinger. The weapon looked like it had been dragged through hell. The Garand buttstock was charred black from the heat of the receiver. The improvised bipod hung loose, the welding point fractured by the recoil of 10,000 rounds. But the heart of the gun, the AN-M2 receiver, was still functional. Stein had spent the night disassembling it in a poncho tent, using rifle oil and a toothbrush to scrub volcanic dust from the delicate feed pawls. "They're moving tanks up," Sergeant Davidson whispered, peering over the crater rim. "Shermans, but they can't see the spider holes." Ahead of them, a platoon of Marines was advancing across the airfield. It was a trap. As soon as they hit the open runway, 3 hidden bunkers opened up simultaneously. The crossfire was mathematically perfect. Marines dropped where they stood. The rest dove for cover that didn't exist. "Cover me!" Stein didn't wait for an order. He surged out of the crater. The stinger, heavy and awkward, swung to his hip. He didn't run for cover. He ran to draw fire. It was a calculated suicide move. By making himself the loudest, most visible target on the field, he forced the Japanese gunners to traverse their weapons away from the pinned-down platoon. Burpee! The stinger roared. Stein walked the fire across the first bunker, the tracers looking like a solid laser beam of light. He wasn't just suppressing them, he was blinding them with debris. Concrete dust exploded in clouds, so thick the enemy gunners couldn't see to aim. He shifted fire. Second bunker. The rate of fire was so intense that he effectively cut the foliage camouflage right off the pillbox, exposing the aperture. "Move! Move now!" he screamed at the pinned Marines. As they scrambled back, Stein's weapon jammed again. A stovepipe jam. A spent casing caught in the ejection port. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. He dropped to one knee, completely exposed. With the calm of a man working at a drill press in Dayton, he pulled his K-bar knife, pried the hot brass out of the action, racked the bolt, and stood back up. He fired a long, punishing burst that silenced the third bunker. The Marines made it to safety. Stein limped back, his chest heaving. The stinger was smoking so badly it looked like it was on fire. The barrel was ruined, the rifling likely stripped smooth by the friction. But it had held. That night, the word spread through the foxholes. "The stinger is still firing." It became a talisman for the 28th Marines. As long as they heard that ripping canvas sound, they knew Tony was out there, and they knew the Japanese were dying. Stein, however, knew the truth. He was running out of parts. He was cannibalizing springs from dead men's bars to keep the mechanism alive. He was using bootlaces to tie the feed box together. The supergun was dying, held together by sheer will and American stubbornness. March 1st, 1945, Ridge 362A. The meat grinder. 10 days. 10 days of continuous combat. The 28th Marines had taken heavy casualties. The initial assault companies were decimated. Replacements were being thrown into the line, kids who had never seen combat, looking at the 1,000-yard stare of veterans like Stein with awe and terror. The regiment was pushing for Nishi Ridge, a complex of caves and ridges that commanded the northern part of the island. It was the heart of Kuribayashi's defense. Stein was leading a patrol to locate a nest of machine guns that had halted the company's advance. He wasn't carrying the Stinger anymore. The weapon had finally died the day before. The receiver cracked, the barrel warped beyond use. It had fired over 40,000 rounds in combat conditions it was never designed for. Now, Stein carried a standard M1 Garand. It felt light in his hands. Too light. It felt like a toy compared to the beast he had built. "Sniper, left flank!" The shout was cut short by a crack. A Marine went down. The patrol froze. They were in a bowl of depression, surrounded by high ground. Stein saw the glint. A cave mouth, 80 yards up the slope. Without the suppression power of the Stinger, he couldn't just stand up and hose the area down. He had to rely on movement. He signaled his squad to flank right. "I'll draw him out," Stein whispered. He broke cover. He moved with the same aggressive, jagged sprint that had carried him up the beach on day one. He fired 2 rounds from the hip, pinging the rock near the cave. The sniper took the bait. A shot rang out, kicking up dirt near Stein's feet. Stein dove behind a boulder, popped up on the other side, and fired. Bang, bang, bang. He hit the sniper. He saw the body slump forward. Clear! Move up! Stein stood up to wave the patrol forward. He never heard the second shot. A hidden Nambu machine gunner, waiting patiently in a spider hole 10 yards away, opened fire. Corporal Tony Stein fell. He hit the black volcanic earth of Iwo Jima and didn't move. The tool maker from Ohio, the man who had built a weapon to defy the odds, had finally run out of luck. The island was secured weeks later. The cost was 26,000 American casualties. When the ordnance officers and engineers finally examined the remains of the Stingers, Stein had helped a few other Marines build similar models before he died. They were stunned. They found welds that should have failed, but didn't. They found trigger mechanisms that defied standard engineering principles. They found a weapon that was theoretically impossible to operate, yet had cleared more bunkers than any tank on the island. The Stinger didn't just disappear into history. The report on Stein's weapon made its way back to the Ordnance Department. Engineers studied the concept: high rate of fire, man-portable, belt-fed. Decades later, looking at the design of the M60 machine gun and the XM214 microgun, historians would trace the DNA of those weapons back to the rusted, welded monstrosity built on Iwo Jima. Tony Stein had proven that volume of fire, superiority by sheer weight of lead, was the future of infantry combat. Tony Stein was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation, signed by President Truman, spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life. It detailed the 20 bunkers, the barefoot runs, the wounded men he saved. But perhaps the greatest tribute wasn't the medal. It was the memory held by the men of the 28th Regiment. For the rest of their lives, whenever they heard a machine gun fire, they didn't hear a bang. They heard the ripping tear of the Stinger, and they saw a shoeless kid from Ohio standing tall amidst the smoke, holding a piece of junk that he had turned into the wrath of God. Tony Stein didn't just build a gun. He built a legend out of scrap metal, black sand, and supreme courage. And he paid for it with the only currency that mattered on Iwo Jima: his life.